Okay, so welcome to the final session of our first day, which focuses on deep services agreements and their effect on trade and value added. We're going to have a presentation from Ingo Borchert, who's the Deputy Director of the UK Trade Policy Observatory, Senior Lecturer in Economics at Sussex, and the co-creator of the Global Services Trade Policy Database, the World Bank, and also Mattia di Ubaldo, a research fellow in economics at Sussex and a fellow of UKTPO. We also have Lucian Cernat here as a discussant. He hails from the European Commission, where he is the head of global regulatory cooperation and international procurement negotiations in DG Trade. So it's really a privilege to have his practitioner's perspective. And I would add that my perspective, having researched this area as a trade lawyer, is how deep services agreements are functioning in practice and can best function is a deceptively difficult question. So I'm very much looking forward to their findings. So over to you, Ingo and Mattia.
Thank you very much, Emily, for setting us off and for setting the bar so high. So it's difficult. I'll try to sort everything out within the next 20 minutes. Let me share my screen. And as you say, this is joint work, and my partner in crime here is Mattia di Ubaldo, and we are both at Sussex. So the analysis of services trade agreement is part of the UKTPO's wider focus on scrutinizing trade agreements, really. So, as a center, we have an interest in this. This paper started out as part of a bigger project at the World Bank on the economics of deep trade agreements. So why should we be studying something as niche as services trade agreements? And the answer is it's not niche. It's all over the place. Services trade policymaking has been very dynamic over the past 2 decades, really. And the question of what exactly constitutes an effective agreement, I mean, generally, but particularly for services, where everything is just, a tad more difficult and complex, I think is quite prominent on the minds of many policymakers at the moment. So I hope I'm not at the choir, but let me motivate, just how important services trade agreements have become. Since 2000, well over 100 agreements with services trade provisions have been concluded. And that world map shows you where the centers of gravity are. It's a Western hemisphere around the US, but also Chile and Peru. It's the EU, and it's Asia Pacific with China and Japan. So Chile and Singapore actually head up that league table with by now 20 agreements. And all of these countries, started out in 2000 with virtually nil, perhaps 2 or 3 services trade agreements. And so the growth in participation has been really quite buoyant. The EU, as of 2017, has 14 services trade agreements, and the US has 13, and Australia and New Zealand have about 10. Zooming in at individual economies, you see that connectivity in services trade, as measured by the number of PTA partners to which a given country is connected through a preferential agreement, has evolved quite differently, actually. It's expanded over time, and there's not much action for some countries here, Brazil and South Africa in green and yellow, but other countries have participated quite buoyantly. And these big steps that you see, I'm not sure whether you can see my cursor, these big steps is when a country here, mainland China, joins a plurilateral. So that is a 2007 ASEAN-China agreement. And that big step here for Australia is a 2010 ASEAN, Australia, New Zealand agreement. And it's also a nice motivating picture because it shows a variation over time in the spread of connectivity. And that's exactly what we will be using to identify our trade effects. So we hope to be contributing with that analysis, empirical analysis, in 2 areas. On the one hand, we are looking at the value of exports, and we find that there's a significant impact on cross-border services trade. Now, one lesson we learned from that kind of analysis is that just sticking in a PTA dummy doesn't usually the trick, but it is rather very specific, ambitiously phrased policy bundles that will then have a significant effect on trade. And we are able to trace this down to a certain ambitious structure of an agreement, meaningful disciplines, and there being transparency and accountability provisions. And on the import side, we look at whether these services trade agreements would also possibly change the sourcing of services value added in a country's services exports. And here again, we find that countries tend to source more services value added when they are connected to a PTA partner. And here it's provisions that would, on the face of it, affect investment and the movement of people, which is at least consistent potentially with a role of these services PTAs as sustaining and facilitating value chains. The two big, to be frank and upfront about it, the two big caveats in that context is that services are but one chapter in big agreements that might run 30 plus chapters. And so we are only focusing on, we are doing a deep dive on the services chapter. And we need to keep this in mind. We try to control empirically for other, for other characteristics of these agreements, but this is really only about services trade. And the other thing is, of course, that these services trade agreements are not randomly distributed across country pairs, and they are not exogenous. And so we try to control for this econometrically with a demanding fixed effects structure. So the plan would be, to give you a bit more detail on that policy data, because that's a novel part of it, and then show you empirical results on the one hand on cross-border services trade, and on the other hand on the sourcing of value added. So this is the World Bank's Deep Trade Agreement database, and highlighted in red is the services chapter on which we focus. But there are 17 other chapters kicking about there, and we try to control for the depth in these other agreements, because you might think that the level of ambition is actually correlated. Now, focusing on that services chapter, we have data on 143 agreements. There are more in the World Bank database, but not all of them have services provisions in it. Some of them are bilateral, a third of them also are plurilateral ones, and they cover these 8 headings here: what's the structure of the agreement, what's the scope, and what are the substantive disciplines. And you see, to give you a little bit more detail to understand what kind of policy information here we are capturing, there are on the one hand these substantive disciplines. For instance, does an agreement have a prohibition on local presence requirements, or a prohibition to apply performance requirements? And that's a substantive discipline, and we can see how that might be trade facilitating. But on the other hand, we have such provisions as just knowing, are there specific provisions clarifying the scope of the presence of natural persons, or is there mutual recognition? But we don't know what it is. And so the policy information that we have is sort of a curious mixture of the architecture, the structure of the agreement, and really depth, narrowly conceived. But the important finding here really is that both matter, right? It's an ambitious structure and scope, as well as meaningful disciplines that we found are having trade effects. How do we go about this empirically? This is a standard, estimable equation that comes out of a structural gravity equation. We do this in a first step on cross-border services trade. So this is on the left-hand side, balance of payments, cross-border trade flows, and therefore predominantly mode 1 and a little bit of mode 4. And we project this on a measure highlighted in red here of services policies. That could be as simple as a dummy, as a PTA dummy, or it could be an individual provision, or it could be most meaningfully, in our view, a predefined cluster of policy areas, of policy configurations. And we'll show in a nutshell that the ambitious policy configurations matter, whereas the shallow ones don't matter. And to the right of that, key variable of interest in red, you have other controls that we would obviously need. There's a control for the depth outside of services. There's an EU dummy, and there's lastly a very sort of demanding set of fixed effects that includes a bilateral pair fixed effects. And that's our best shot at taking care of the perennial endogeneity concerns, or anything that might be specific to any given country pair in the sample will already be consumed in these fixed effects. And in terms of data, you might have guessed, we combine services trade flow statistics on the left-hand side with these kind of policy data that I was trying to sketch briefly on the right-hand side, and that sets us up for our empirical analysis. So let me get cracking into some empirical results. Here you see results from a standard gravity model where we just in the first column have a simple PTA dummy. And here, that doesn't do the trick because there's so much noise both in the services PTAs, but also between countries or economies that participate in services PTAs and those that don't, that is just too noisy a measure. But interestingly, we get a little bit of traction when we then break this out by type of agreement. And here we find that simply on a contemporaneous basis, a bilateral PTA is associated with about 9% higher bilateral services trade. And moving on to the third and fourth column, then these effects obviously need a little bit of time to trickle down and take hold in trade statistics. And if we look after 2 years, bilateral agreements are now associated with, on average, about 20% higher value of services exports, and that's actually now quite meaningful. And to tie this back to the policy data, what you see here are in blue provisions, the frequency, the incidence of provisions of bilateral FTAs, and you can see here on the left a couple of these substantive provisions, prohibitions on local performance requirements, on technology transfer, that are just much more prevalent in bilateral agreements as opposed to plurilaterals. And that's the reason why the bilateral agreements are more associated with trade effects. But let me come on to the more actionable, the more meaningful results, and because we now need to unpick that PTA dummy. And the way we go about this is that we define for certain policy areas, such as the structure of the agreement, its scope, and the modes of supply, combinations of individual provisions where we would say a priori that combination of policies defines an ambitious approach. For instance, in terms of structure, it should have a negative list approach. It should have at least separate chapters for the different modes of supply. It should feature a standstill clause, and it should feature a ratchet clause. And in similar way across other policy areas. And if you define the policies in that way a priori and let the data tell you which of those matter, then you will find that it's actually the most ambitious kind of provisions that now have very substantial and significant trade effects, to the tune of about 50%. These are results for 2 policy areas: that's the agreement structure, an ambitious agreement structure, and the rules of origin. Now, some of these policy configurations might actually be quite frequent, like on the right-hand side, rules of origin. The most frequent policy configuration that we encounter in these agreements is actually not very meaningful. And so it is associated with an absolutely nil, zilch, trade effect. And it's the liberal mode 3 mode that are then driving the trade results. That's nothing new. That's just the regression, the analytical regression table underpinning the previous visual depiction of results. But again, you see how this works. In green, we juxtapose the ambitious policy configuration, and they are almost invariably associated with big and significant trade effects, and the placebo ones, where these policy provisions are not ambitious or are shallow, and there's nothing in here. And if you were to summarize the magnitude of these results, these range in between 15 to 65%, and it holds. It stands the placebo test. Now, what we do then in the very last step on trade flows is that we push these estimations that are done on aggregate services trade down to individual types of services trade, in particular the regulation-intensive ones, financial and pension services, other business services, and the exchange of intellectual property rights. And we can show that these trade effects are actually driven by those certain kinds of services that are arguably regulation intensive and therefore stand to benefit from these services trade provisions. So that's on the export side of services PTAs. Let me switch gears and give you a short flavor of the other kind of strand of inquiry that we're doing in that paper. And now we are looking towards the import side and the question where the services value added actually is coming from. And these are value added shares. This is a stylized picture where a lot, and that's actually true for any country, a lot of the services value added in services exports actually, is sourced domestically. So that's typically a big share. And then you might have two countries, one of which you have a services PTA with, and the other one you trade at arm's length. And so suppose the US would have a services PTA with Korea, which of course they have, then this could potentially lead to two kinds of effects. You could, on the one hand, start to source services value added from Korea as opposed to domestic suppliers. And that is true internationalization, or you could actually, that additional Korean services value added could potentially come at the expense of an outsider with which the US does not have an agreement. And the way we pursue this empirically is with this estimable equation that takes exactly the same structure as the structural gravity equation that you have seen a minute ago. And again, you see the exact same picture on, shown with the example of provisions on rules of origin. It's in the upper part of the graph, you have the policy bundles on rules of origin that are ambitious. And that means liberal provisions on what kind of professionals and what kind of firms actually benefit from that kind of agreement. And in the bottom half of that picture are the provisions that are most frequent and second most frequent, but are not ambitious at all. And so it's the same kind of approach. I think I'm coming up to 19 minutes, so let me wrap up. I think we find significant and to me initially actually surprisingly large effects on cross-border services trade. And that's on a balance of payments basis. If you compare this with a figure of my friend Yoto's work on merchandise on manufacturing goods trade, where they find in that 2019 paper average FTA effects of 34%, that's even larger in services, and that's quite surprising. And we also find effects on services value added sourced from PTA partners. So these are our main findings. Where do we want to take that work? I should say, and people have in the past sort of taken issue with the terminology, these are average partial effects on trade. It's just a partial equilibrium effect. It's not in any way yet a general equilibrium trade impact. And some people call this the trade impact. We're currently trying to map the GE, the general equilibrium effects of these agreements. And that should be quite promising because you've got small countries, big countries, and how the GE effects actually pan out is probably quite interesting. We have the data from the incredibly rich World Bank database on other chapters. And I think we can probably do a little bit better in controlling for the depth in other relevant chapters that might also have a bearing on services trade. And largely, but that's clearly a different paper than at some point, these agreements are not exogenous. And there's another paper to be done on why do some countries at some point in time conclude these services trade agreements. Thank you very much. Let me stop here. And I'm very keen to hear from Lucian.
Thanks very much, Ingo. Can I just remind people to put any questions you have into the Q&A box and not the chat, and now I'll hand over to Lucian.
Thank you, Emily. Hello, everyone. And it's a real pleasure to be part of this event, to see old friends like Ingo and others from the UKTPO. And I'm really delighted to have had the chance to read in advance Ingo's paper with his co-author. So now I have my new key performance metric that I would suggest to our services trade negotiator. I would say to them once we have a services chapter, a draft chapter in an EFTA. Did your services chapter make the Ingo and the Ubaldo estimate statistically significant? And that's how we will now try to look at some of these agreements through a very quantitative lens. But I think what's really probably the most important element in such a well-crafted paper on trade and services is, if we step back for a second, is the dire need for such analysis. I don't claim that I have any official statistics on the discrepancy between academic research on trade and services as opposed to other types of trade policy topics and research, but do a quick search on Google Scholar, for instance. It takes you a split second. You'll see that if you were to search for services trade papers and for agriculture trade papers, or for papers on industrial products, or for papers on anti-dumping, you will always find a 1 to 10 ratio. So for every one paper, for every single paper on services, there will be 10 papers on agriculture, probably agriculture trade, or 10 papers on anti-dumping, or maybe 100 papers on manufacturing goods, or all sorts of sectoral analysis. So the big point, and I think this is probably the most valuable contribution that colleagues like Ingo and his co-authors have done over the years, is to bridge that gap. You look at the sheer value of trade in services in the overall global trade values, and not just for the EU, but also for other countries. The EU remains the largest exporter of services as a trading bloc. We're extremely competitive in services. I think the UK probably, relatively speaking, even more so, because for the UK, proportionately speaking, I think the share of services trade is compared to goods trade, it's bigger than for the EU. And beyond these very simple comparisons, I think trading services has a lot of specificities that are poorly understood, even today. And that is probably also because of the lack of systematic services trade statistics. You looked at any modeling type of data that would allow you to do econometrics or partial equilibrium or CG modeling. You pick your analytical tools. No matter which tools you're going to pick, you will always find a lot more data on goods trade and on services trade. We have paddy rice versus husk rice. We have all sorts of other statistics on agriculture. So no wonder that we have 10 times more papers on agricultural trade than on services trade, because data was there for people to use. But now we are in a much better position. I think over the last few years, there were major advances in trade and services statistics. We have the kind of efforts that the World Bank, the OECD, and the WTO, they carried out independently or jointly to bridge that gap in terms of services trade policy variables, so trade restrictiveness, this kind of data that Ingo used on mapping provisions of FTAs in such a very sophisticated manner. And we also have trade and services statistics by modes of supply, the famous modes of supply, since whether you like them or not, this is how trade negotiators set rules either at the WTO or at the GATS or in FTAs. So now we're in a very good position to put all these things together. And this is why I think this type of papers we've seen today are extremely valuable. So I think one key conclusion I took after reading the paper is that unlike the usual saying that less is more, when it comes to services chapters for FTA, unfortunately, sometimes less is nothing. So don't settle for less. I think that's one of the key policy messages that indirectly Ingo passed on to all of us in the trade negotiating community. I think it's also important to make this connection between trade in services and trade in goods, which Ingo made very clear as well. I remember when we try to estimate the impact of certain FTAs on trade and services, there were a number of questions that would systematically come up. So one question, for instance, would be, did the FTA change in any meaningful way the existing regulatory environment? Did the FTA partners have to change any rules whatsoever? I mean, if you're a company and an exporter of services, will something change for you in such a way that you will find it easier as of the day of ratification for you to export services? Sometimes the answer is not much, but that doesn't mean that the services chapter is not useful, because there is a second benefit people get from an FTA with ambitious services provisions, and that is that the rules, the predictability of rules is enhanced by the fact that you have now binding commitments, which will prevent countries to put in place perhaps protectionist measures. And we've seen that protectionism, we're not vaccinated against protectionism, and this can manifest itself in hundreds of barriers in the future. So if an FTA prevents new protectionism, that has values for it's very valuable for companies. So when you do such analysis, these binding commitments are extremely important. Then, how to separate these two effects, I'm not sure exactly. That is very easy, but I think the kind of data that we've seen being used in this paper might allow us to do that. And I think another important element, which I really like this example with 3 countries, 2 of them who now will sign an FTA, the stylus facts that Ingo presented with US, Korea, and China, for instance. These are the kind of effects where you would see very clearly that an FTA makes a difference if you can quantify them. So I think that's extremely useful for policymakers to have tangible examples on how services FTAs would contribute to the overall increase in trade and prosperity. And I think there's probably one element that maybe Ingo and his co-author could add to the analysis, because I think in that little stylized fact with the before and after FTA kind of distribution of and the composition of trade in value added with the services content, the ones that now get more imported from Korea and that would replace imports from China or domestic services, there's probably also an additional effect which could have been easily shown perhaps by making the after type of bar higher, because if you import as a result of an FTA more services from the most competitive supplier, things are going to get cheaper, and then probably you'd increase the demand for those products that now incorporate services. So the bar, I think that the overall size of the bar after the FTA could also be conceivably higher than the one before when you had barriers in place. But these are just 3 very quick remarks on otherwise extremely interesting papers. So I'd like to once again congratulate the authors, and I look forward to reading the next papers, since I see that the further work ahead is well mapped out. So no need for me to add any suggestions to that list. Thank you very much.
Thanks very much for that, Lucian. Ingo, did you want to respond to that?
Yes, sure. Quickly, if we've got the time. So, this is extremely encouraging, Lucian, and thank you very much for your kind comments. I've sort of sold my soul to services trade like more than 10 years ago, and there have been times when I was regretting it. But someone saying that that's actually useful work, so you made our day. So thank you very much for your kind comments. The lamppost phenomenon is clearly there, and we have to take these analyses, even though I would maintain that we try and do the econometrics, with all these kind of ambitious fixed effects, as rigorous as we can. We have to take it with a grain of salt, because the services trade flow statistics are not typically up to the same quality as our merchandise or agricultural trade statistics are. A couple points on, you made a wide range of comments. Let me be selective. One is a trade in services by mode of supply, the TISMOS database. Of course, we all know that data set. It is desperately needed. I would just, like to say that a lot of the entries in that data set when it comes to mode 3 is actually estimated. And so, you can't just, stick this into a gravity model in the same way as we have been doing it, because then, that would be, ever so slightly circular. Because in the best case, you would just recover the coefficients with which these data has been estimated and then, thrown into the Dismos data. And I'm exaggerating a little bit. It is a fantastic data set, but we have to be sort of slightly careful not to use it for an FTA evaluation exercise in the same way as we've been doing that. But having said that, of course, your point is extremely well taken, that we all of this in the paper, both the services trade flow part and the value-added part. No, the value-added part is based on TIVA, but the services trade flow part is just based on balance of payments statistics. That's predominantly mode 1 with a little bit of mode 4 thrown in, and the big white elephant in the room is mode 3. And we just don't have the data really to run a full-fledged 2 equations model. I would like to give a shout out to the most recent paper from 2 economists at the US ITC, who have just provided us with probably the frontier paper on switching modes of supply. I think it's called The Road of Mode Switching in Services Trade, Tamar Kachaturian and Sarah Oliver. But what they do is they find a cross effect, if you will, of investment barriers on cross-border services trade. And that's very, very interesting. And there's obviously a complementarity coming out of their analyses in a way that we might perhaps expect. And we are not in a position to do this yet, but more needs to be done here. And lastly, you say the bar on the value added could well be higher if we just could get cheaper and more competitively priced services inputs from abroad, once we conclude an agreement. I couldn't agree more. We've been long saying in UKTPO that services inputs and services value added in any economy, but in a very pronounced way in the UK, these services value added inputs are a major factor in competitiveness of any economy when it comes to manufacturing exports. I completely agree with your idea. It's just a different object of interest. So what we have been looking at, and I'm glad for the opportunity to clarify this for everyone, it's a services value added share in a country's services exports, right? So on the one hand, it goes in, and the PTA facilitates what comes in for the benefit of being exported. And we look at both services exports and overall exports. What you are suggesting is something slightly different. It's assessing the role presumably in competitiveness, and we need to think about how we would operationalize this of services inputs. But I completely agree with you. It would be a very nice analysis. Let me stop here. But I would like to say I very much like your metaphor. I would love for all of us to be doubly vaccinated against protectionism. So if we cannot just come up against this, that would be great.
Can we get a tweet? So we have a few questions coming through, and the first one, stay with us, Ingo. The first one is just a methodological clarification from Harry Calthorpe. He wants to know if he's not familiar with your data set and wants to know if your analysis includes services trade that has been bundled with goods trade.
Yes, no, the short answer isn't, but it is an absolutely fantastic question. You will never get to observe this in official trade statistics. You will need to do this on firm level data, where you get to observe an individual firm's international trade transactions across both goods and services, and then you can observe whether or not it's bundled or not. We are trying to do this on UK firm level data, but it's a different kind of analysis because it would require an entirely different data set. But I think, Lucian was also alluding to this clearly. Services exports or services trade and goods trade at the firm level are sort of correlated, from a business perspective. And you are absolutely spot on, Harry, that an analysis with the most granular firm level trade data that we could get, would want, to look at just that.
Okay, great. Then we have a question from Pascal Kernes from the European Services Forum, who wants to know when the economists and services trade negotiators are going to gang up to push for more systematic collection of data from services sectors. When is this wide hole in econometry going to be solved, and why isn't this being taken seriously by economists and statisticians?
Well, I know Pascal for a long, so thanks, Pascal, for that question. I mean, in fairness, and I think Lucian has made this point, relatively speaking, we've come a very long way. We've got a lot better services trade flow statistics now, and I may say that I have a little bit of a hand in this because I'm a co-creator of that international trade and production data set for estimation that we are using here, and the international organizations, the World Bank, the OECD, the WTO, they are all ganging up in a very positive sense of getting us much better policy statistics and policy information in the services realm. So we are getting there, probably not as quickly as we would all like to, but I think it's fair to say that we've made massive progress in the past 5 or 10 years, really.
Okay, so we also have a question from Michael Gaziorek. He wants to know, have you looked at cross-model and cross-sectoral impacts? So in other words, if you go deep ambitious in one area, which one might think is associated with one mode of services trade, how does that impact upon other modes? Or what are the impacts of sectoral liberalization measures on different modes of supply? Or does the data not make this possible to look at?
Yes, well, that's a great question again. Not in a sense in the first part of the paper, which is the services trade flows. There we are just able to distinguish between different types of services, and the most we can, the farthest we can go there is to show for what kind of services trade these agreement provisions matter. But we get a little bit to where you are going, Michael, in the TIVA part, in the second part of the paper, where we actually show that it's the provisions on mode 3 investment and movement of service professionals as natural persons are associated with higher imported services value added. So, we don't have ownership data because we don't have firm level data, but at least this is suggestive of the fact that provisions that on the face of it pertain to different modes of supply, namely mode 3, establishment of commercial presence, and mode 4, people, service providers, moving, actually have an impact on imported services value added. And that, is indicative, at least, of value chain activity that is presumably then also underpinned by cross-border investment and ownership links. But, with our data, we can't go further than that.
Okay, so I see the same question again, this time from Dirk Willem. So I think that was misattributed to Michael. That was actually Dirk's question. So thank you, Dirk. So I think I might take my chair's privilege and ask a question, which perhaps is a naive question, but when we look at sort of deep services agreements, I'm thinking of CPTPP or USMCA or CETA, we have this big emphasis on reducing regulatory divergence through regulatory cooperation or regulatory coherence, if you prefer. So we have things like sort of joint sector specific committees of domestic regulators who try to overcome divergence. So I'm wondering if such provisions figure in your sort of ambition index, or how do you quantify or understand their effectiveness if such a thing is possible?
That's a great suggestion. We don't, because even though the services, the policy data on these provisions is, at an unprecedented granular level, what we get from the World Bank Deep Trade Agreements database, we have a total of like 63 individual measures. There's nothing in that bunch of 63 measures that I think would speak to joint committees or regulatory coherence or so. So we don't have the policy data really to follow this up. But I know that there's a small strand of literature out there that tries on an MFN basis. That's the difference. It's on the preferential PTA basis, but it's on a MFN basis where people construct these services trade policy restrictiveness indices, and they try to square them up on a bilateral basis, and they define then an index of regulatory heterogeneity. And typically they find that services trade between countries whose regulatory profile is more similar, they trade more. So I can just report back to you that kind of stylized fact in the empirics literature. I think we can't make the deep trade agreements data speak to regulatory coherence, which is a real shame, because it's an excellent thought. Yeah.
Okay, well, I think we need to wrap up now. So thank you very much to Ingo and Mattia for your research, and for Lucian for your interesting comments. I'd like to invite the presenters, as well as anyone who would like to speak to them, to move across to Wonder now. I assume Tina is posting the link. I don't have access to that chat, but I assume Tina will be posting the link now. For everyone else, okay, I see it. I see it. Okay, so for everyone else, I'd like to say that we've reached the end of the first day of our conference. So thank you to Tina, as well as Aristea and Charlotte and George for your organization efforts, and congratulations, as it seems things went very smoothly. As Michael promised this morning, I think we've already taken an interdisciplinary look at inclusive trade this afternoon. We've covered a lot of ground. If you'll permit me a very quick recap. In the first two sessions, we looked at post-Brexit agri-food law and policy, and the implications for the role and the influence of developed nations, and how these reforms shape trade, both in the UK's internal market and also its agricultural subsidies and the WTO. And then we learned about the relationships between trade liberalization and market power, and what kind of variables influence that relationship, including their implications for consumers and for workers. We learned about how the TCA has impacted upon trade in goods thus far, and that particular UK exports to the EU, notably food and textiles, have been the most affected. And finally, we learned something about how deep services FTAs are functioning in practice, and what types of provisions are the most effective, and how this in turn influences the configuration of value chain trade. So thank you all for coming. We look forward to seeing you again tomorrow. I'm sorry we don't have any coffee, or even better, wine to offer you, but I'd like to invite everyone over to Wonder for a post-day one virtual catch-up.